Hello, once again. Welcome to the second part of our discussion series on Kierkegaard's Abraham. It's BMA, and you can subscribe to my channel and like the videos if you find the discussion quite resourceful. The last time we left on a cliffhanger on why is Abraham not prosecuted as a murderer and instead hailed as a man of faith, a patriarch of faith? Why wouldn't he be prosecuted for attempted murder? Yet he violates all the good that lies in the ethical obligations of a father to a son. That's a fundamental question, because in today's society, or societies before, if a man were to wake up and say that they are they have been instructed by God to sacrifice, to take their son or daughter, take their life in the form of shedding blood and offering up for a sacrifice, we would view them as mad, or we would prosecute them in our courts. Yeah. And if you were to look at that scenario and compare it to a situation where a hospital needs to save medication, and to do so they perform a euthanasia. They euthanize some patients who have whose life is deemed to have lost meaning because of the pain and the suffering that they would go through if their life were to continue. So there is an end of life decision in which a medical practitioner or somebody, or the medical facility or institution, decide to cut off the life support of a patient who is in a coma, or who is deemed to be in a vegetative state, even when they are revived and they finally come back to a state where they can interact with some aspect of their environment, but they are again in a vegetative state. So if you decide to end the life of that patient so that you can conserve the medication and all the medical needs of society, can preserve them for other patients, it would be seen as an ethical move. It would be deemed ethical in the interests of the many. But somebody who says that let me take my son and go and sacrifice him or her to God, this one we would call a mad person or a serial killer. We would have some labels. But the question that we should ask ourselves is, why don't we have the same for Abraham? Why is he instead hailed as a man of faith and not a man who attempted murder? It's a very good question. So he's a man of faith and not someone who attempted murder. So that's why Kierkegaard introduces a concept that he calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. I'll repeat that. The teleological suspension of the ethical. Teleological, the term teleological comes from the Greek word teleos. Now the telos in Greek is the ultimate and the ultimate. So when you practice ethics, there's some ethical theorists who say that ethics in itself is a telos. It's the end of human societal practice. Ethics is an end in itself. So ethics is not it's not a means to an end, that it's an end in itself. Ethics. So Abraham's actions, when you are to view them from the ethical lens, he should be prosecuted for attempted murder. He should be called a murderer, but instead he is called a man of faith. Yet the same courtesy is, if you extend the same courtesy to Agamemnon and Jephthah, they are called heroes in the tragic sense. The reason why Agamemnon is not called a murderer is because his actions are for the good of all. So what is Kierkegaard's point in the teleological suspension of the ethical? What Kierkegaard tries to say is that the ethics is not the telos. For Abraham, the ethics is not the telos. It's not the end. It's not the summum bonum. The term summum bonum is the great. It means the great good, the ultimate good, the greatest good, the summum bonum. It's not the highest good. So for Abraham, the highest good lies in his duty to God. So for Abraham, at least, the ethical is not the ultimate good. Rather, the ultimate good is him heeding the instruction to God, the religious. So Kierkegaard, I'll not go into the complicated stuff that he has for his readers. Introduces the aesthetic, the ethical and the religious, the dialectic, the Kierkegaardian dialectic. I will not get into that because it's not the point of discussion. The point of this video is to examine and make the monologue as less complicated as possible. So for Kierkegaard, the telos is his religious duty. So if the ethical is suspended teleologically, so it's not the ultimate end. So the teleological suspension of the ethical, the concept that Kierkegaard introduces in Fear and Trembling, means that for Abraham, there's a teleological suspension of the ethical, in the sense that the ethical is not the summum bonum, it's not the highest good, but rather the highest good for Abraham is the religious, his duty to God, his heeding of instruction, and believing in the promise. That's his highest duty. That becomes the ultimate good, the highest good. It's not ethics. It's not the ethical, because it's not. Nobody else can understand Abraham other than himself and God. Only two people understand Abraham and his actions, that is God and himself, because of his faith in God. So there is no ethics. It's suspended as the highest good. So for Abraham, the ethics is suspended. So there's a teleological suspension of the ethical. It's no longer the telos. So the telos for Abraham is his duty to God. So when you assume a position of faith, what seems as the ethical duty to society no longer becomes the highest good, but rather your duty to God. That's why Abraham is not called a murderer, because his duty to God supersedes ethics. So when his duty to God supersedes the ethics, which would be to become a good father unto his son, protect, defend the son from all harm, which is the ethical duty of a father to a son, no longer becomes the ultimate good. This is not to mean that Abraham hated Isaac, or he did not fulfill he should not fulfill his duties, such as protecting him from harm, standing in for him before all dangers, and all, everything that seems to go against the good of his son. So he, in a sense, all this responsibility is suspended as the end ultimate good, at least. So faith is this thing in which, by virtue of the absurd, the night of faith, has the ethics suspended. He no longer has to fulfill the ethical obligations, because they would contradict his duty to God. That's the most complicated bit in Abraham. The teleological suspension of the ethical, at least for that time or at that point, the telos does not lie in the ethical, but rather in the duty that he has towards God. Absolute duty to God. But does that mean that Abraham did not fulfill his ethical obligation? Because ultimately, he did not offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And yet he did. So there is a glaring contradiction. Abraham offered his son as a sacrifice, and he did not. There are two senses. There's a sense in which he offers Isaac as a sacrifice, and there's a sense in which he doesn't. So in him going through the motions and offering Isaac, to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, he takes the journey of a night of infinite resignation. As we said earlier, the absurd is a sense in which a night of infinite resignation becomes a night of faith. That's the absurd is what makes a night of infinite resignation a night of faith, and the absurd is reversing the condition of infinite resignation. So when you have gone through the motions of accepting, of going, of partaking of an action that leads to a loss, and you resign yourself to the loss, but again believing in the contrary, it's like thesis and antithesis kind of scenario. These are diametrically opposed things. So Abraham offers his son as a sacrifice, and then he doesn't offer his son as a sacrifice. So you have two contradicting positions. They're diametrically opposed. He does both. In him climbing up the mountain and going through the motions of loss, and in him telling people, his servants, that he and his son will come back. So these are diametrically opposed actions. So Kierkegaard argues and says that Abraham observed the ethical in a sense. The ethical is bypassed because his belief is far and beyond the ethical, in a sense that it observes it within the beyond. The beyond. So he believes far and beyond the ethical into his the religious obligation that he has towards God. So he offers Isaac as a sacrifice in obedience, because he went through the motions. He does everything a night of infinite resignation does. But again, he doesn't offer his son as a sacrifice. So there's a sense in which he offers, and there's a sense in which he returns with Isaac. So the Isaac that Abraham goes back with is not the same he went up with. So all in all, Abraham received another Isaac. By going through the motions of loss and reconciling himself with his pain and loss, Abraham sacrificed Isaac. But in believing in the absurd, through the utterances Jehovah Jireh, he received Isaac again. So this is the most confusing bit about Abraham, because he offered his son as a sacrifice. In his mind, in his being, he offered his son as a sacrifice. Even before God, he offered his son as a sacrifice. But before God, he received his son again. That's why he is more glad a second time. He is more glad when he goes back with Isaac from Mount Moriah than he received him from Sarah's womb that had been barren for years. So Abraham fulfilled the ethical without necessarily having it as the telos. Abraham fulfilled the ethical obligations of a father to a son, or a father to a daughter, or a mother, or a parent to a child, without having to go through, without having the ethical as the ultimate good or the end, the purpose. So for Abraham, the ethical was not the purpose. The purpose was God. So in having God as the purpose, he suspends the ethical as the purpose. So that's what is meant by the teleological suspension of the ethical. The teleological suspension of the ethical. The ethical does not become suspended as the purpose for Abraham's actions. Agamemnon's actions are for the ethical. That's the purpose. That his sacrifice would be of benefit to the Achaean Greeks in their war against the Trojan Greeks. So when he offers his daughter, there is a purpose. The ethical is the purpose, that in his sacrifice the Achaeans will emerge victorious. So the ethical is the purpose. In Agamemnon, in Jephthah, same case, the victory of Israel against his enemies is his purpose, is the purpose of his sacrifice. And that purpose is now the ethical. That's the ethical. So the ethical is the ultimate in both Jephthah and Agamemnon. But in Abraham, it is not. It is suspended as the purposeful end. It is teleologically suspended It is not the purpose again. So in Abraham, the purpose is to fulfill what God has ordained. So that's why you cannot use the laws and rules and regulations surrounding the purpose, the ethical as the purpose, to judge Abraham. Let me repeat that part. You cannot use the ethics to judge Abraham because it is not his ultimate end. It is not his telos. So the only laws, regulations, and rules that you can judge, by which you can judge Abraham, are in whether or not he fulfilled his duty to God. So the telos shifts, and in the shifting, the ethics is suspended as the telos, and the religious becomes the new telos. It becomes the new purpose for Abraham. So you cannot call Abraham a murderer. And Abraham is not a murderer because his telos dictates, or rather dictated, that he ought to have offered his son as a sacrifice. Thank you.